Hey everyone, Pixel Murderer here, and welcome back. It's been a while since I made my last video, but I am finally coming back to make another one. And in this video, I'm going to be reviewing CrossCode. I've been wanting to do a review for a while now, and I thought, well, since I just beat CrossCode for the first time, like a few days ago, it's a perfect opportunity to try out this kind of video. I might make more of these in the future. There's no guarantee, but hopefully. And yeah, let's get into it. So let's start with the gameplay. And then within the gameplay, let's start with the combat. The combat was really satisfying. There was a ton of options you could choose from, but it never felt like an overwhelming amount of options. It was like, I don't know. The options were really nice. You had the circuits, for example, which I'll get to that in a moment. And you also had all the other variety of options, like the weapon types. I found it an interesting choice that they limited what kinds of weapons you could actually get. Like, you can get, say, I don't even remember the names of all the weapons, but you can get, okay, there, I thought of the name of one, the Ice Walkers, for example. You can get those in Bergen Village, and they come in at, I think, level 19 or 20. But the thing is, you're never going to find those Ice Walkers again, and you can't level them up. They're always going to be level 19 or 20 or whatever it was. And that's a really interesting choice, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad choice, nor do I think it's a good choice, but it's certainly interesting that they chose to do it like that. I also really like the enemy variety. The enemy variety really keeps things interesting because you're constantly finding some kind of new enemy that you didn't find before, and it's just always surprising. Like, it's never gets old, I feel like. Even when you beat the game, like, the variety is good enough that when you come back to it, even though you fought these enemies before, it's still pretty good. And on top of that, the boosters in the late game / post game, they're really great because they allow you to go back and fight the old enemies and bring back the enemy variety. Because at some point, there's no point in going back to the old enemies unless you're looking for a specific item, because they're just so weak, they don't give you any XP. But in this game, you can grab a booster if you have the materials for it, and you can just go back and fight them, which is really cool. Another thing I really liked about it was circuits. I thought circuits were pretty good. They did have some problems, unfortunately. Circuits weren't too confusing or anything, but there was a bit of a problem in that they weren't super effective, unfortunately, like the melee arts and whatnot. That stuff was good, because, I mean, those are always nice. New movement options, right? But the stat increases were too low, honestly. Like, you're only getting like 4 or 5% with each stat increase, which, you might argue that added up, it starts to get a bit more, but I don't know about that. I feel like it could have been a bit better. Elements were also really good because it just adds an extra layer of depth, I guess. Especially when you consider like all the things you can do with the elements. Like, if you hit those like bomb-looking things that aren't actually bombs, I don't know what they're called. If you hit those with, say, the wave element, they can go through walls. If you hit it with the electric element, then it goes along the walls. Cool stuff like that just makes it really fun. And not to mention areas that are locked for the player until they get a certain element are also really cool, because it means lots of backtracking, which is great. As well as that, I really liked that it had lots of strategy, and it was a very involved kind of thing. And what I also really like is that the combat, you can just use brute force if you want to. It's not the ideal strategy, but you can do it. And it's cool because it encourages strategy, but it doesn't usually force you to use it. Which is a nice compromise, because I know some people just don't like strategy, and if someone doesn't like strategy and they're forced to use it, they won't enjoy the game. But here it gives you an option, although it definitely encourages strategy, which is a good thing. And so yeah, I really enjoyed the combat in this game. Puzzles are next. And what I really like, they didn't feel brainless. I know a lot of puzzle games I've played, well, not puzzle games, but a lot of games with puzzles that I've played have had the puzzles feel way too easy, and they're really mindless, and you don't even remember them 10 seconds later. But in CrossCode it was different. These puzzles actually required thought, they required effort. They're not just an easy peasy kind of thing. Yeah, it's true that they can be a bit too hard. In fact, you're probably going to need a guide for most of them. But they the problem is kind of dealt with, luckily, which I'll get to in a moment. But the dungeons in this game are a bit long, especially with the fact that the puzzles are so hard. It makes it a bit much to deal with, and it can be pretty difficult. I highly recommend using a guide if you're playing CrossCode, because it's going to be pretty difficult without one. Yeah, and as I said, the problem is somewhat dealt with. So the player is allowed to actually leave the dungeon midway through and return to it at any time, which is really nice, because if you're getting like overwhelmed or burnt out by the dungeon, you can just leave for a while, do some other stuff, maybe level up if you're feeling like you're a bit too weak, go buy some food, find some chests, whatever you want, and then you can just come back and leave, go back to where you left off. Really cool, because it allows for it helps you not to get burnt out by these puzzles. Really a smart choice. Even so, it's still a little frustrating, but it gives you a great sense of accomplishment. So I guess I should say it's worth it. It really is worth the trouble, and the puzzles are pretty good. They're just a bit too hard. And so the next section, platforming. Platforming in this game is one of my favorite parts. Finding chests and hidden areas in this game is a lot of fun because it requires platforming. It may seem like a small little detail, but really it means a lot, because you have to actually think about what path you're going to take to get there, because there's usually only one path to get there. And that's a really cool idea, because it helps the player actually have to think about the collectibles rather than just suddenly stumbling on them and be like, whoa, I found a collectible. It's a lot more thought requiring. Is that how you'd say it? I don't know. Yeah, it makes the game very immersive and feels explorable, if you know what I'm trying to say with that. I thought it was really well put together, and the world just feels so much bigger with this because you have an extra layer, right? Or multiple, actually. You can go to all these different layers and find stuff there, and it's really cool because it feels like a massive world, even though it's like actually one of the smaller ones out there. That's a great idea, I think, and I think more games should try doing that. On top of that, there is a problem, though. There's a problem. The depth perception. I'm sure everyone who's played CrossCode realizes that this is a problem, but the depth perception is definitely troublesome. It can sometimes be hard to tell which layer you're on and which layer another platform is on, and that often results in like failed jumps and stuff. Luckily, you do start to get used to it as you get further into the game, but it's still a bit of an issue, and I wish there was a way to fix that, but I don't really think there is, unfortunately. So it's kind of a problem that the game is stuck with, It's a shame, but what can you do? So yeah, overall, it makes the game a lot better, the platforming. Even with the problem of depth perception, it's still really, really important to the game. So, next, let's talk about the story. But before we actually start talking about it, I should give you a spoiler warning, because I'm going to be talking about the ending and pretty much all over the story. I'll probably put a timestamp somewhere, maybe in the comments, maybe in the description, maybe like on the video. I don't know how I'll do it yet, but I'll put a timestamp, so look for that if you don't want to be spoiled. So yeah, now let's get into it. So, first of all, there were a lot of plot twists, which was really a great thing. Plot twists are always a good thing in games, because stories in games tend to be a bit predictable, but this one wasn't. This one was different. It wasn't predictable at all. it constantly was surprising me, and I could never predict how the story was going to go. My idea of what the story might be at the beginning completely changed by the end of it. I also didn't find any noticeable plot holes, which is always a plus, because the less plot holes you have, the more immersive the game is, right? That's a big thing, right? Plot holes are more important, more of a disadvantage than people seem to think. I also really like the idea of Leah being an AI. Yeah, I know it wasn't brand new. It was not an idea that hadn't been done before, but it was still a great choice, and it really worked well for the story here. And as well, I also thought that it was awesome how there's two people that could really be considered the antagonists here. Both Gotham and Sidwell really could be considered antagonists, right? Most games only have one real main antagonist. You might have like a secondary one or even tertiary one, but it's rare to have two that are like both the main antagonist. And yeah, that was a really great idea. I don't know, maybe they didn't really plan for it to be that way, but whatever the reason for it, it turned out pretty well. I was also really fooled by this game's story, because I actually thought for the longest time that Shizuka was evil. I mean, anyone could be excused for thinking that after at around, where was that, Sapphire Ridge maybe? I think it was Sapphire Ridge, and it makes sense that you might fall for that, right? And I think it was intentional, but even if it wasn't, that's still really cool. Also, I love the idea of that post-credit scene with Citron. I don't know how you say his name. Catron? Don't know. But I love that post-credit scene where it hints at the fact that maybe he is in some way connected to Sidwell the entire time. That was really cool, because the entire time I assumed, I just thought it was kind of obvious that he was on your side. But apparently he might not have been. Or actually, he almost certainly wasn't. That's super cool, and I thought that was such a great little detail. They didn't even need to add that, but it just added to how great this game is. I also really enjoyed the Vermilion raid. It was a great idea because it gave an excuse for all the characters that Leah meets on her journey to just all come together and join in for one final raid. Like, it's always more fun when all the important characters all come together. Except this time there was a especially good reason for why that should happen, and it actually made sense with the story too, which is great. That's just an extra thing that just makes it that much better. And I also thought it was cool how they have a good and bad ending. A lot of games just have one ending, or alternatively, they have so many endings you don't even know what to do with them. Here, you have two endings, and that's perfect. One bad ending, one good ending. I haven't actually seen the good ending yet, sadly. I'm working on it. I'm gonna take a look at the good ending as soon as I can. But I saw the bad ending, and even the bad ending was actually kind of satisfying. Even if it was sad, it was still a satisfying ending in its own way, which is how it should be. Also, I should take a moment to talk about the world. The world building is so well done. There's so much good stuff in its world and how it's designed. I don't know, I really enjoyed the world of this game. It's unique. It also has just enough of well-used tropes that it just, because you need some tropes, right? Without any tropes, you're just kind of doing an anti-trope, which, I don't know, is that really a good thing? I don't think so. But yeah, the world was so well designed, and it felt real almost. It was a very immersive world, especially with the idea of this entire thing taking place in an online MMO. That's such a good idea. And at first I was actually seriously thinking that maybe this is actually an MMO game, because you know how there's always characters just running across the screen? That's super cool. A little detail that just makes the world way more immersive, to the point where I thought it was an actual MMO for a few minutes. And that's really cool. Not many games are able to manage that. It's probably like one of the best ways to do that out there. And anyone else making an MMO inspired game should take inspiration from this. So overall, the story was really good, and it drew me in from start to finish. never once did I lose interest in the story, and it was super memorable. So now, the characters. Leah is probably my favorite video game character ever. There, I said it. Nice and simple. She's just such a great character. It's crazy how much they were able to do with a character who's pretty much mute. And they were forced to get creative. The devs, the devs had to get creative with Leah because she can't really talk, and it really shows how much effort they put into making facial expressions for her, and it's such a great way to make a character interesting because that's not something you normally see in video games. Really expressive faces. You sometimes see it in cutscenes in like more realistic games, but even there it tends to be a bit less expressive than in say a movie or a TV show or whatever. But here the expressions that Leah has on her face all the time are great, and some of the other characters as well, though not all of them obviously. They couldn't do that with every character in the game, naturally. I wouldn't expect them to. And in general, all the characters have really interesting personalities, and I really enjoyed all of them. Not one of them really fell flat to me, you know what I'm saying? I'll admit, Lynn was a bit meh. She wasn't the best character ever, but other than Lynn, honestly, the rest were all really well developed. And I guess Lynn isn't a major character, so that's kind of to be expected, I guess. I also like the idea that they used stereotypes, like particularly stereotypes about each character's home country, especially with Lucas and Emily. Great idea. Just makes it a bit more fun, and keeps things interesting, And overall, I'd say my favorite characters in order: Leah, Emily, and Apollo, with honorable mention to Lucas. Yeah, overall the characters were realistically written, and very memorable too, and had a lot of good humor moments, like they made a lot of good jokes as well. And yeah, so let's move on to the content. It took me about 50 hours to beat CrossCode. 50 hours. That's pretty long for an indie game. For a AAA game, like that's pretty much expected for most bigger like larger scale games. But for indie games tend to be on the shorter side. Well, that's not the case with CrossCode, apparently. I got it for $25 Canadian on my Switch, and it was definitely worth it. There's collectibles and side quests as well, so you could up that number to around 70 to 75 hours, and that's with a guide for the story and for the post-game stuff. So, can you imagine how long this game is if you're not using a guide? That's insane. Over 100 hours of content in an indie game. I'm really impressed. I know not everyone's in it for large amounts of content or whatever, but even so, it's great how they were able to get so much content into this game without it ever feeling repetitive or fillery. Is that even a word? No, I don't think that's a word. You know what I mean, though. And that's not even including New Game Plus. There's even a New Game Plus mode, no kidding. And on top of that, the game has lots of replay value, and a DLC is in the works. So, if you need something that you'll be able to play for quite a while, CrossCode is a pretty safe bet, because this game has a ton of content. Next, let's talk about the audio a bit. The soundtrack is pretty good. I particularly liked Rhombus Square, Bakikum, or whatever it's called, the desert city, and Bazin Keep. I wouldn't call it a top tier soundtrack, honestly, but it's definitely one of the better ones I've heard. And for performance, I played it on Switch, as I said earlier, and there was sometimes lag in some of the larger battles, but it was never anything terrible, honestly. My game did crash once in my playthrough, but for 50 hours, that's kind of not that bad. It's not that bad. And it was in the final boss fight as well, so, I mean, what do you expect? It's in the final boss fight where there's tons of stuff happening at once. It happened during one of the lightning attacks, so if you've fought the final boss, you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. And then the loading screens are pretty fast. They're not like super fast, but they're fast enough. And so, yeah, overall, I'd say performance isn't perfect, but it does the job. It's good enough. There's not really any, like, terrible performance issues, at least from my point of view. But then again, I should warn you that I'm not exactly a someone who knows exactly how good the performance of a game is. I couldn't even tell you if it's 30 FPS or 60 FPS, honestly. So take what I say about the performance with a grain of salt. So now let's get to the final verdict. So I should probably explain the scale I'm going to be using first. A 1 is horrendous. That basically means never play this. Nothing else to it. A 2 is terrible, which means it's still playable, but you don't want to play it at all. Like, it's playable, but not bearable. A 3 means awful, and that means it probably has 1 or 2 redeeming features, but it's still garbage. A 4 is bad. That means it has some hints of quality, but still not at all worth checking out. 5 is fine. It's alright. It has good, but it also has a lot of bad. 6 is decent, which means it's not bad, but could use a lot of improvements. 7 is good, which means it's worth it, but don't expect any kind of like magnum opus or something like that. 8 is great, which basically means it has some issues, but is able to be great despite those issues. 9 is amazing, which means it's a must-play and has very few flaws and does a lot right. And 10 is a masterpiece, which also is a must-play, of course, and I don't really see how anyone could actively dislike a game with a 10 rating. By that I mean, like, someone saying it's a bad game, I wouldn't be able to understand it. With a 9 rated game, I could still see 1 or 2 people here and there saying that it's a bad game, objectively, but with a masterpiece game, like a 10 out of 10 game, that means I cannot understand how anyone could dislike it. So, with that being said, my score for CrossCode on the Nintendo Switch is a 10 out of 10. It has quickly become one of my all-time favorite games, and the gameplay was really fun, had lots of variety, the story hooked me from start to finish, and was really thought through. The characters were all really cool, and it's got tons of content as well. It can be a bit too difficult at times, and, you know, the minor performance issues as well, but the good definitely drowns out the bad in CrossCode. I don't give 10s very easily, just so you guys know. This is obviously the first review I'm doing, so there's nothing to compare it to, but let me just say, if I continue doing reviews, I will not be giving out 10s easily. I just happen to start with a perfect 10 game. This doesn't mean, of course, that CrossCode is a flawless game, but it does mean that it's pretty dang close. So, with that being said, thank you guys for watching. I'm thinking I might do Mario Kart Wii in my next review, if I do another review. So, you know, stay tuned for that if that interests you, and comment down below, what do you think of CrossCode? Is this a game you want to try out? Is this a game you've already tried out? Yeah, just give me your thoughts down below. I'd love to hear comments, which I don't get too many comments, so when I do get them, I always make sure to read them, and if they're anything worthwhile, you know, if they're anything interesting, I usually respond to them as well. So, with that being said, thank you guys again for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye!